You know that feeling, right? That kind of knot in your stomach before a big test, the way your mind just goes blank sometimes, all that pressure. Most of us have probably felt that, yeah, at academic stress. But what if that pressure, maybe amplified by federal education policies, is having deeper impacts, hidden impacts we haven't really talked about? Today, we're taking a deep dive into exactly that, the unexpected effects of high stakes standardized testing on students here in the US. And we're talking about things that go way beyond just the test score itself. Our mission here is to unpack this really comprehensive narrative review by Robert White, PhD. He's looked into the hidden costs of policies like No Child Left Behind and the Every Student Succeeds Act over the last 20 years or so. We want to uncover what the data is actually telling us, including some, well, pretty surprising physiological and psychological effects. It might make you rethink things.
It's really quite striking how Dr. White's review pulls everything together. You've got peer-reviewed studies, government data, policy reports, all synthesized. And it shows how these policies connect to student stress responses, mental health trends, even academic engagement. The whole picture is trying to give a holistic view to inform the policy debates happening right now.
Okay, let's dig into that. So we're talking about big federal policies, No Child Left Behind back in 2002, NCLB, and then later, the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESA, in 2015. These weren't small changes, were they? They really aimed to shake up American education. What was the thinking behind them? What were those big goals?
Well, the intentions, you have to say, were definitely noble at the start. They were aiming for better educational equity, making sure schools were accountable for how students were doing, and driving academic improvement. NCLB, for example, it mandated annual testing in reading and math in certain grades, and it set this incredibly high goal, 100% student proficiency by 2014.
Wow, 100%. That is ambitious.
Extremely. Yeah. But the intention was admirable, right? To fundamentally change education, make sure no child got left behind. ESA, later on, kept the core testing, but did start to acknowledge the link between mental health and academics. It even okayed some funding for school mental health.
So the ambition was definitely there. Equity, improvement. But maybe, were those goals almost too ambitious? Did that itself create new pressures? Because this is where Dr. White's review gets really interesting, I think. It challenges what we assume those policies actually achieved. Despite all that focus on testing, driving improvement, the academic gains, well, they haven't really materialized as expected. In fact, the review points to this troubling paradox, a decline, actually, on independent measures.
That's exactly right. If you look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP.
That's the nation's report card, right? The
Yeah.
independent one.
Precisely. It's seen as a reliable benchmark. And the NAVP data shows a really concerning pattern. After some, modest gains, maybe in the early 2000s, reading and math performance basically flattened out. And recently, significant declines. The 2022 NAEP results, they showed historic drops. Math scores down 5 points in fourth grade, 8 points in eighth grade, compared to just 2019.
8 points in eighth grade math. That sounds like a lot.
It was. They were the biggest drops recorded since 1990 when they started tracking it this
Yeah.
way. And it didn't stop there. The 2024 results continued downward trends. Reading scores fell another 2 points for both fourth and eighth graders. And maybe most alarmingly, 34% of eighth graders are now scoring below basic in reading.
34% below ASIC.
Yeah, that's the highest percentage in the entire 32-year history of the assessment. Performance is back to where it was in the 1990s, essentially.
So 2 decades of this intense focus, and we're back to 90s levels in reading for eighth graders.
That's what the independent data suggests. It really questions whether the pressure delivered the intended academic results. And this leads to another critical point Dr. White's review brings up, this idea of score inflation.
Score inflation, what does that mean?
It means state test scores often showed improvements, sometimes significant ones.
Okay.
But those gains just weren't reflected in the NAEP data. The independent measure didn't show the same rise.
So the state tests looked better, but the national benchmark didn't.
Exactly, which suggests that maybe the gains weren't always about deeper learning. Maybe it was more about test preparation, getting good at taking that specific test. It implies the accountability system might have unintentionally incentivized teaching to the test rather than fostering genuine broad understanding.
That's disheartening. All that effort, all that pressure, and the independent measures are going down, while state scores might be masking that. It really forces you to ask, like you said, if the goal was learning, are we hitting it? Or is something else happening? Because this isn't just about test scores in a vacuum, is it? Dr. White's review shows something else happening at the same time. Alongside this academic picture, there's this growing crisis in student well-being. Let's talk about mental health.
Yes, and that's a crucial part of the story. While this focus on scores was intensifying, national data shows student mental health was worsening. There was a National Education Association report in 2019. It found 70% of teenagers saw anxiety and depression as major problems among their friends.
70%, that's huge.
It is. And get this, 61% said the main thing stressing them out was pressure to get good grades,
More than social media, more than family issues.
more than anything else they were asked about. That intense academic pressure was number one, which is really startling when you think about it. And some researchers, like Gray in 2023, are even suggesting a possible link between NCLB's implementation and rising rates of anxiety, depression, even self-harm in young people.
Wow, so a direct link is being suggested.
It's being explored seriously. Think about it from a student's perspective. Maybe you're great at art or history or figuring things out hands-on, but you feel like your entire value, your future, depends on just one or two scores on these standardized tests. That's immense pressure. And school counselors, they're seeing this firsthand. They report unprecedented numbers needing mental health help, anxiety being the top issue.
They're on the front lines.
Absolutely. And here's a real irony. During those high-stakes testing weeks, when student stress is probably peaking, counseling staff often get pulled away from counseling to help administer the test.
Oh no, right when they're needed most.
Exactly. It's a system caught in a bind.
That paints such a concerning picture, the anxiety, the pressure. It feels overwhelming. But what if I told you there's actually biological proof? Objective evidence measuring this stress inside students' bodies. This is where the physiological evidence comes in. It's pretty groundbreaking stuff.
It really is. This comes from a very rigorous study by Heisel and colleagues back in 2021. It was the first and kind of the most robust research to directly measure physiological stress responses to high-stakes testing in K-12 students. Not just asking them how they feel, but measuring it.
How did they do that?
They measured cortisol levels. That's the body's main stress hormone. They tracked it in students during regular school weeks, during low-stakes practice tests, and then during the high-stakes state testing weeks.
Okay, so comparing normal days to test days, what did they find?
The findings were pretty compelling. On average, students showed a 15% increase in cortisol levels during those high-stakes tests compared to regular days.
15% higher stress hormones.
And for boys in the study, it was even more dramatic, a 35% average increase.
35%, wow.
But here's where it gets really critical for education policy. This stress wasn't just, unpleasant. It directly impacted performance. Students whose cortisol levels changed the most, the ones showing the biggest stress response, they scored significantly lower on the high-stakes exams.
How much lower?
About 0.40 standard deviations lower.
Okay, what does 0.40 standard deviations mean in real terms?
That's a good question. To put it in perspective, it's roughly like dropping 80 points on the SAT scale.
80 points. That's a huge difference. That can absolutely change college admissions, scholarships.
Exactly. It's a difference that can genuinely affect a student's future path and opportunities. And the policy implications here are massive. It suggests that what we often call achievement gaps between different groups of students might actually be, at least in part, stress gaps.
Stress gaps. I've never heard it put that way.
It fundamentally challenges the fairness and the validity of these tests if some students are performing worse simply because they're experiencing a greater physiological stress response.
How does the cortisol actually affect performance, like biologically?
Well, elevated cortisol, especially chronically, interferes with key cognitive functions. It impacts memory retrieval, makes it harder to recall information you actually know, and it disrupts executive functions, things like concentration, planning, flexible thinking. Basically, it hinders the exact mental processes you need to do well on a complex test. The stress itself gets in the way of showing what you know.
That's incredible. Biological evidence showing stress directly lowers scores. Okay, so we have these pieces. Declining academic results on reliable measures, rising student anxiety, and now biological proof of stress impacting performance. Let's connect the dots. Why is this happening? How do these big federal policies actually filter down and create these outcomes?
Yeah, understanding the how is key. We can look at it through a few theoretical lenses. Robert Merton's idea of unintended consequences seems really relevant here. Unintended consequences, right? Policies, even with good intentions, can have unforeseen negative effects. Maybe because policymakers didn't fully understand the conditions on the ground, or they made errors in analysis, or maybe they prioritized short-term metrics over long-term well-being. With testing, perhaps they underestimated just how complex student motivation is, or the real impact of stress on learning. Focusing on the numbers maybe, more than the humans involved.
Okay, so unintended effects. What else?
Then there's policy implementation theory. This basically says there's often a gap between what a policy intends at the federal level and what actually happens when it gets put into practice.
Like a game of telephone?
Sort of, yeah. The original message gets filtered and changed as it goes down through state agencies, school districts, principals, and finally to the classroom teacher. So a federal goal of accountability might turn into very rigid, specific test prep drills at the school level that maybe weren't the original vision at all. That's policy drift.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the direct stress pathways. High-stakes tests aren't random stressors. They're predictable, often unavoidable. This repeated activation of the body's stress response isn't just temporary. It can lead to chronic stress, what scientists call allostatic load.
Allostatic load, like wear and tear.
Exactly. It's the wear and tear on the body and brain from being stressed too often or for too long. And that directly interferes with learning and performance over time.
It makes sense that these big policies get interpreted, maybe even twisted, as they move down the chain. But what does that look like in the classroom for a student, for a teacher, day to day? What actually changes in schools because of this pressure?
Dr. Weiss' review highlights some very clear, observable changes. One of the big ones is curriculum narrowing, meaning schools start spending much more time on the subjects that are tested, usually math and reading, and less time on everything else. There was a study in Chicago, for instance, back in 2005 by Jacob. It found schools significantly increased math and reading instruction time after high-stakes testing came in. But at the same time, they cut back on science, social studies, art, music, often by similar amounts.
So the untested subjects get squeezed out.
They often do. Imagine being a kid who loves science experiments or gets really fired up about history or finds their voice in art class. Under this kind of pressure, those subjects often get less time, fewer resources, or are even cut. It sends a message about what's considered important.
And what about how teachers teach? Does that change too?
Definitely. That's the instructional practice changes. Teachers report spending a huge amount of time on test-taking strategies. How to bubble in answers, how to manage time, how to approach specific question formats.
Less focus on the actual subject matter.
Less focus on deep understanding or exploration. Yeah, more focus on mastering the format of the test itself. Many teachers feel forced into this, even if they know it's not the best way to teach, because the pressure to get scores up is so intense it replaces richer learning with basically test prep.
Training kids to pass tests, not necessarily to think critically.
That's the concern.
Yeah.
And then you also see reduced support and enrichment. Budget pressures combined with the relentless focus on test scores often leads to cuts in things like art, music, PE, even recess.
Recess. But isn't that important for kids?
Absolutely. These are activities that historically helped kids manage stress, be creative, find other ways to feel successful and engaged in school. Cutting them can remove vital outlets. And finally, all this creates a climate of continuous evaluation. School becomes low about curiosity and learning and more about constant performance measurement. Student self-worth can get tied directly to test scores, which just ramps up the anxiety.
Wow. Curriculum narrowing, teaching to the test, cutting arts and recess, constant anxiety. That's a pretty stark picture of the ripple effects. So given all this, what's the alternative? Are there other ways to do education that support both high standards and student well-being?
That's the critical question. And yes, we can look internationally for different models. Finland often comes up.
Finland, right. They always seem to do well on international tests.
They do. Consistently high performers on PISA tests. That's the big international comparison. But here's the thing. Finnish students take almost no standardized tests until they're around 16. Assessment is mostly done by teachers in the classroom.
No high-stakes tests until 16, but still high achievement. How?
Their system explicitly prioritizes student well-being. They have shorter school days, more recess, a huge emphasis on play in the early years. And they put a lot of trust and resources into teacher professionalism rather than relying on external high-stakes accountability. It suggests high achievement and low stress aren't mutually exclusive.
So that's one model. Are there others?
Well, on the flip side, you have some East Asian countries, like South Korea or Japan. They often achieve very high test scores, but through incredibly intense competition and pressure. A test hell, some call it.
And what's the result there?
Alongside the high scores, they grapple with serious student mental health issues. High rates of anxiety, depression, tragically even high suicide rates among young people.
That's a terrible trade-off.
It's a cautionary tale, definitely. It forces us to ask what price we're willing to pay for test scores. In fact, countries like South Korea and Japan are now actually trying to implement reforms to reduce the testing pressure, because they recognize the human cost.
So high scores aren't everything if the students are suffering. Those comparisons really show different paths, different consequences. Okay, let's bring it back home then. Based on Dr. White's review, what are the big takeaways for U.S. policy? What could we actually do differently?
The review suggests several key directions for reform. First, and maybe most fundamentally, we need to redefine educational success. Move beyond just test scores in math and reading. We need to value things like creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, social emotional skills, the whole child.
A broader definition of success.
Exactly. Yeah. Second, that leads to multidimensional accountability. If we value broader skills, we need to measure them. Accountability systems could include things like student engagement surveys, measures of school climate, opportunities for arts and PE, alongside academic scores. Give a fuller picture.
So not just the test score determines if a school is good.
Right. Third, we need more developmental appropriateness in assessment. What's suitable for a 17-year-old isn't necessarily right for an 8-year-old. We need to align testing with what we know about child development, especially for younger kids. Maybe less high-stakes testing early on.
That makes sense. What else?
Fourth, a shift towards support-focused interventions. Instead of punishing schools or teachers for low scores, focus on providing resources, high-quality professional development, support systems to help struggling schools actually improve their capacity. Build them up. Don't just label them as failing.
Support, not just sanctions.
Precisely. And finally, the review points to immediate actions schools and districts can take right now, even within the current system. Things like setting reasonable limits on pure test prep time, teaching students actual stress reduction techniques, protecting mental health staff and resources, training all educators to recognize signs of chronic stress in students.
Practical steps that could make a difference tomorrow.
They could start to alleviate some of the immediate pressure, yes.
This deep dive really highlights this disturbing pattern, doesn't it? Declining academic achievement on reliable measures, running parallel with rising student anxiety and stress, and the biological evidence connecting stress directly to lower performance. It really makes a compelling case for rethinking these high-stakes testing policies. It's hard to ignore the possibility that the very tools we designed, with good intentions to improve education, might actually be undermining the students they're meant to serve.
The review strongly suggests that excellence and well-being aren't opposing forces. They should be complementary.
Yeah, which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to chew on, doesn't it? What if the very things we built to guarantee equality in schools are inadvertently damaging our students' ability to flourish? And how could we build a system that truly values both, that values, humanity and rigor? Performance and well-being, what would that look like? A system that empowers every student to reach their full potential, not just perform on one kind of test. Something for all of us to think about, I suppose, as we navigate our own learning journeys or think about the kids in our lives.